The Machiavellians by James Burnham. Part 3. Mosca, the theory of the ruling class. Mosca's surname literally means fly, like the insect, not the verb. This may seem unflattering, but in Italian, the word Mosca may be used to convey positive personal attributes. The Italians use the expression una mosca bianca, or a white fly, to identify rare or exceptional individuals, akin to the English black sheep, but with a positive denotation. Indeed, Mosca represented the qualities of a white fly. His most famous work, The Ruling Class, 1884, earned his acclaim as a pioneering thinker in political science. In fact, the original title of his work, Elementi di Scienza Politica, translates to Elements of Political Science. Emulating the first political scientist, Niccolò Machiavelli, Mosca exhibited an independent mind and a cold, calculated theory of politics and power. Note, the following brief biography of Mosca does not appear in James Burnham's book, but nevertheless merits consideration as it places Mosca's work in the context and life of his times. Since Mosca left no memoirs, many details of his early life remain undocumented. However, what is known about his background provides crucial context for understanding his writings and intellectual development. He was born on April 1st, 1858, in Palermo, Sicily, to a middle-class household. Though not a wealthy family, the Moscas nevertheless maintained a degree of social prestige. Mosca's mother, Teresa di Stefano, came from a family of local prominence. His father, Francesco Mosca, held a position as a civil servant in the complicated Sicilian bureaucracy. His father's occupation likely instilled in the young Gaetano an appreciation for government and administration, which later featured as central themes in his political treatises. Growing up in Sicily during the 19th century, Mosca's early years coincided with a period of significant social and political upheaval in Italy. Mosca grew up witnessing the revolutionary period of the Risorgimento from 1815 to 1871, a series of political movements and wars for independence which concluded with the unification of Italy. Thus, by the end of the Risorgimento, on March 17, 1871, the 12-year-old Mosca already lived through several revolutionary wars. The Second Italian War of Independence in 1859, Garibaldi's Expedition of the Thousand in 1860, and the Third War of Italian Independence in 1866, just to name a few. Moreover, Mosca's home island of Sicily played a pivotal role in the Italian unification process, particularly during Giuseppe Garibaldi's 1860 expedition, when the island became the first southern territory incorporated into the nascent Italian state. In the tumult and aftermath of the Risorgimento, Mosca's childhood city of Palermo faced a litany of political and economic challenges. The city and the surrounding areas of Sicily confronted lingering feudal structures of old, as well as new tensions between the local population and the emerging central government. Growing up with this tension between Sicily and the new central government while witnessing the chaos and completion of a political revolution, Mosca earned an early education regarding basic facts of political life, that governments and revolutions are always led by a small, organized minority. This reality became a central focus of his later writings. But Mosca's exposure to complicated political times did not end with his childhood. He lived through not only the Risorgimento and the unification of Italy, but also witnessed the rise of Mussolini and Italian fascism. Upholding both conservative and liberal principles, Mosca's political views were as complicated as that of Italy's political history. In fact, since the end of World War II in 1945, Italy managed to burn through no less than 69 governments, a turnover rate of slightly more than one each year. It should be noted that Mosca initially supported fascism because, following Machiavelli, he believed Italy required a strong central government to maintain a stable, orderly society. Of course, Mosca was not alone in his early support of fascism. To take an example closer to home, Franklin Delano Roosevelt also expressed a curious, if superficial and fleeting, degree of appreciation for Mussolini's governance. Shortly after his inauguration in 1933, a White House correspondent reported that FDR called Mussolini admirable and was, quote, deeply impressed by what he has accomplished. But it should be noted that FDR's statement expressed a broader sentiment among many Western leaders that governments should take a greater responsibility for their national economies and attempt some degree of experimentation. Such ideas were not uncommon in the face of the global economic depression. Like FDR, Mosca's endorsement of Mussolini waned as fascism quickly deteriorated into a totalitarian nightmare. In 1925, Mosca signed the Manifesto of the Anti-Fascist Intellectuals, written by Benedetto Croce and signed by hundreds of individuals, 270 of whom were brave enough to have their signatures published. Though, as previously stated, Mosca held some conservative views, He also maintained a commitment to certain liberal principles, such as free speech, balance of power, and legal due process. Mosca's support of intellectual freedom and legal due process partly derived from his career as a lawyer. He obtained a law degree from the University of Palermo in 1881 and went on to sit as chair of constitutional law at the University of Turin, a position he held from 1896 to 1924. Meanwhile, from 1909 to 1919, Mosca served as an elected official to the Italian Chamber of Deputies, roughly equivalent to the American House of Representatives. He also wrote for one of Italy's oldest newspapers, the Corriere della Sera. Mosca's background in law, government, and journalism made for an excellent intellectual of political affairs. But again, Mosca was a white fly, a rare and extraordinarily original thinker. He had no problem taking unpopular positions, and indeed his distrust of popular opinion exhibited in his extreme skepticism of the masses and therefore of democracy. Moreover, his writings contributed significantly to what became known as the Italian elitist school, which followed the Machiavellian tradition of realistic, dispassionate analysis of politics and power. What follows is a summary of Mosca's intellectual thought, as described in Part 3 of The Machiavellians by James Burnham. Chapter 1. The Machiavellian Tradition. The first chapter of Part 3 of The Machiavellians does not require much elaboration, as it essentially restates Parts 1 and 2, which you can find a summary of in the previous video. Burnham reiterates the Machiavellian tradition of dispassionate analysis of politics and power through the lens of Mosca's political analysis. As was true of the other members of the Italian elitist school, Mosca's application of the Machiavellian tradition led him to reject any monistic theory of history, or reducing all historical events to exactly one singular cause. Such theories were quite popular during Mosca's time. In the late 19th century, for example, racial theory and climatic theory attributed all societal events to race and climate. In the same vein, Mosca also refuted proponents of economic materialist theory, like Karl Marx. Also in keeping with Machiavelli, Mosca maintained that society is always governed by a ruling class. However, as we shall see, Mosca took these basic facts of political life a few steps further. Chapter 2. The Ruling Class. Following Machiavelli, Mosca divided political life into two classes of people, rulers and ruled. In the ruling class, Mosca observed that every society in history was ruled by a minority. In this work, Mosca also set out to discredit two popular opinions of his time that he found grossly misconceived. The first, that a single individual can rule society, and the second, that the majority, the masses, can rule themselves. In effect, for Mosca, every society is a de facto oligarchy. As he said, 100 men acting uniformly in concert with a common understanding will triumph over 1,000 men who are not in accord and can therefore be dealt with one by one. In practice, this nullified the power of popular elections. As Mosca explained, the interests of the voters are too disparate and disorganized to be fully satisfied by a few political candidates. Furthermore, if voters could individually choose their ideal candidate, power would be spread across a constellation of politicians, thus rendering them politically inviable and ineffectual. The practical necessity of a primary in the American political system illustrates the inevitable rule by a minority. The will of the voters must be concentrated upon a few politicians in order for their vote to have any political power. But this is not unique to the American system, as Mosca pointed out. Quote, if his vote is to have any efficacy at all, each voter is forced to limit his choice to a very narrow field. In other words, to a choice among 2 or 3 persons who have some chance of succeeding, and the only ones who have any chance of succeeding are those whose candidacies are championed by groups, by committees, by organized minorities. Mosca divided the ruling class into 2 groups, a very small upper class occupying positions of highest importance, and a larger middle class who managed the even larger lower class and direct the daily activities of the citizenry. Among the ruling class, Mosca believed this middle class of managers to be more decisive than the upper class, an idea Burnham elaborated upon in his earlier work, The Managerial Revolution, 1941. According to Mosca, the upper class is neither sufficient nor large enough to direct the affairs of the masses. From this, he concluded that the stability of any polity depends on the intelligence, morality, and activities of the middle class of managers. Elaborating upon Machiavelli's concept of virtù, Mosca asserted that, quote, any intellectual or moral deficiencies in this second stratum accordingly represent a graver danger to the political structure, and one that is harder to repair than the presence of similar deficiencies in the few dozen persons who control the workings of the state machine. Again, following Machiavelli, Mosca divorced morality from his science of politics. He aspired to describe the political world as he found it, but also in keeping with Machiavelli, Mosca did not completely ignore discussions of moral values, goodness, and justice. As Burnham clarified, quote, Mosca does not try to avoid making moral judgments, but they are meaningful only within the permanent structure of society. Put in terms of Burnham's distinction between real and formal meaning, morals are only meaningful in terms of their real meaning, or their instrumental value in the context of the political structure in which they operate. From a Machiavellian perspective, the value of a set of moral principles is directly proportional to the degree of political stability they provide. Thus, the moral qualities of the ruling class, especially within the middle class of managers, are of primary importance for Mosca, which leads us to Chapter 3, the composition and character of the ruling class. In keeping with his rejection of monisms, Mosca dismissed attempts to apply Darwinian evolution directly to society. However, he found evolutionary theory useful when applied indirectly to social life, and with a slight yet critical modification. It is worth noting that Darwin's concept of evolutionary fitness did not amount to survival of the fittest, which was Herbert Spencer's formulation. Darwin based his theory of evolutionary fitness on progeny, or the ability to generate offspring. In short, Darwinian evolution depended on how successfully a specimen passed on one's genes. Darwinian fitness does not mean being the biggest, baddest SOB around. Rather, it means being the most successful mate, the most successful generator of offspring. Put another way, it is the survival and propagation of one's genes, rather than the survival of the fittest. Mosca replaced Darwin and Spencer's focus on progeny and fitness with what he called struggle for preeminence. Quote, if we consider the inner ferment that goes on within the body of every society, we see at once that the struggle for preeminence is far more conspicuous there than the struggle for existence. Indeed, Mosca's struggle for preeminence more closely resembled Spencer's survival of the fittest than Darwin's theory of evolution. Mosca's struggle for preeminence and Spencer's survival of the fittest both imply some degree of domination, whereas Darwin's theory of evolution merely connotes the intergenerational survival of one's genes. But Mosca's concept went even further than Spencer's, since it implied domination not merely in a physical sense, but also in a political and psychological sense. Upon replacing Darwin and Spencer's ideas of struggle for existence with the struggle for preeminence, Mosca identified the most typical traits of the ruling class. Similarly to Machiavelli's concept of virtue, Mosca did not include wisdom, self-sacrifice, and altruism among the necessary qualities of the ruling class. As Mosca said, quote, to raise in the social scale, even in calm and normal times, the prime requisite, beyond any question, is the capacity for hard work. But the requisite next in importance is ambition, a firm resolve to get on in the world, to outstrip one's fellows. In short, for Mosca, the first prerequisite for preeminence is hard work. The second requirement is ruthless ambition, unfettered by moral scruples. As Mosca paraphrased Machiavelli, states are not ruled with prayer books. Yet another similarity with Machiavelli, Mosca attributed a degree of importance to fortune, or what Machiavelli called fortuna. The easiest and best way to enter the ruling class is to be born into it, but inheritance alone is not enough to guarantee a family's permanent position in the ruling class. Thus, in addition to hard work and ruthless ambition, Mosca identified a third trait of the ruling class. Quote, members of a ruling minority regularly have some attribute, real or apparent, which is highly esteemed and very influential in the society in which they live. These esteemed and very influential attributes are what Mosca called social forces. Similarly to Burnham's distinction between real and formal meaning, Burnham clarified that these attributes can be either real or apparent. What is important for a member of the ruling class is that enough of the population believe in his power or ability over a given social force. In primitive societies, Burnham explained, the primary social forces are usually war and religion, but as civilization expanded, observed Mosca, the number of social forces increased. Quote, for example, property and money, as the fruit of industry and commerce, comes into being alongside of real property. Education progresses. Occupations based on scientific knowledge gain in importance. Thus, since the ruling class must possess, or at least appear to possess, abilities which the people generally find valuable and influential, Mosca concluded that the relationship between the rulers and ruled cannot be completely arbitrary. This relationship between the rulers and the ruled is communicated by the ruling class to the ruled class through what Mosca called a political formula. For example, the racial myth in Nazi Germany explained the position of the ruling class in terms of racial superiority. Burnham identified two aspects of Mosca's political formulas. First, they are often related to myths broadly shared by a number of nations, as he says, quote, so that several political formulas appear as variations on similar basic themes. And Burnham pointed to examples of major transnational religions such as Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism. Such religions, Burnham pointed out, unlike most earlier religions or current ones like Japanese Shintoism, are not necessarily bound to a specific geography. Secular examples include Rousseau's ideas of the innate goodness of man, progress, and humanitarianism. Interestingly enough, Mosca believed collectivism was the logical result of Rousseau's democratic myth. Indeed, as we shall see in the case of Mosca, Sorel, Michel, and Pareto, the Machiavellian tradition is often, though not always, at odds with Rousseau. The second aspect of Mosca's political formulas is that they are essential to the survival of a society. If the formula changes abruptly, society is destroyed. If the formula requires change, it must be done gradually in order to ensure societal stability and survival. Widespread skepticism of the political formula will call into question the relationship between the rulers and the ruled, thus disrupting the status quo and disintegrating political arrangements of power. As Burnham speculated, quote, it is perhaps for this reason that all strong and long-lived societies have cherished their traditions, even when, as is usually the case, these traditions have little relation to fact, and even after they can hardly be believed literally by educated men. From these premises, Burnham reached a rather startling conclusion. The execution of Socrates in Athens was completely justified, because Socrates was spreading skepticism of the political formula upon which Athenian civilization rested. To allow Socrates to live would mean to allow the further disintegration of society, which would end badly for all Athenians, not just Socrates. Chapter 4. Tendencies in the ruling class. Mosca identified two principles of the ruling class. First, the autocratic principle, or the downward transmission of authority, and the second, the liberal principle, or the upward transmission of authority. From these principles, Mosca observed the necessity of hierarchy, subordination, and obedience in human organizations. As he put it, quote, there can be no human organization without rankings and subordinations. Any sort of hierarchy necessarily requires that some should command and others obey. Taking these principles one step further, Mosca apprehended two tendencies of the ruling class. First, the aristocratic tendency, wherein the ruling class aims to replenish itself with members of the upper classes, and second, the democratic tendency, wherein the ruling class seeks to refresh itself with elements of the lower classes. Though these tendencies are opposites, they must coexist to ensure societal stability. For a society to survive and remain stable, it must allow for some degree of circulation of the elites, but it also must maintain some degree of continuity within the ruling class. And Burnham helpfully pointed out examples of autocracies with mostly democratic tendencies, as well as liberal systems with mostly aristocratic tendencies. Quote, there can be, as there often have been, in spite of common opinion to the contrary, autocracies which are primarily democratic in tendency and liberal systems which are largely aristocratic. The most remarkable example of the former is the Catholic Church, which is almost perfectly autocratic, but at the same time is always recruiting new members of its hierarchy from the masses. On the other hand, modern England during many generations was in many respects liberal, but by various devices preserved an aristocratic continuity of the membership of its ruling class. For further examples of democratic organizations with autocratic tendencies, Mosca cited revolutions in general. As Burnham summarized, quote, a revolutionary movement ordinarily proclaims that its aim is to do away with all privileges of birth, but invariably, once it is in power, the aristocratic tendency reasserts itself, and a new ruling group crystallizes out from the revolution. Additionally, as Mosca warned, quote, it is not so certain that it would be altogether beneficial to the collectivity to have every advantage of birth eliminated in the struggle for membership in the ruling class. Both tendencies, aristocratic and democratic, and both principles, autocratic and liberal, are present in all societies. Predominance of one principle or tendency over the other, according to Mosca, usually preceded a period of rapid or revolutionary change. In this way, Mosca identified constant factors of power, or aspects of politics present in all societal organizations across time. Again, keeping with the Machiavellian tradition of applying a scientific approach to politics, this is quite similar to science in its method of identifying constant variables, though obviously not quite the same. Another characteristic of politics that remain constant across time are methods of propaganda. It might be surprising to learn that methods of propaganda deployed today are not new. In fact, they are quite old. And indeed, for Mosca, such methods of propaganda remain constant throughout history. And for this reason, Mosca is worth quoting at length here. Whatever their origins, the methods that are used by the people who aim to monopolize and exploit the sympathy of the masses have always been the same. They come down to pointing out, with exaggerations of course, the selfishness, the stupidity, the material enjoyments of the rich and the powerful, to denouncing their vices and wrongdoings, real and imaginary, and to promising to satisfy a common and widespread sense of rough-hewn justice, which would like to see abolished every societal distinction based upon advantage of birth, and at the same time would like to see an absolutely equal distribution of pleasures and pains. Often enough, the parties against which this demagogic propaganda is directed use exactly the same means to combat it. Whenever they think they can profit by doing so, they too make promises which they will never be able to keep. They too flatter the masses, play to their crudest instincts, and exploit and foment their prejudices and greeds. Having identified the constant factors among all governments in history, Mosca moved to the variable factors that characterize the best and worst governments. Chapter 5. The Best and Worst Governments. Following Machiavelli, Mosca believed in what he called relative justice, that the best form of government is relative to each particular nation's unique geopolitical and historical situation. However, in somewhat of a departure from Machiavelli, specifically his idea that force is the first condition of liberty, Mosca defined liberty in terms of what he called juridical defense. As Mosca defined it, the social mechanisms that regulate this disciplining of the moral sense constitute what we call juridical defense, respect for law, government by law. Mosca encouraged his readers to note that his view is, quote, contrary to the doctrine of Rousseau, that man is good by nature and that society makes him wicked and perverse. As Mosca elaborated, we believe that societal organization provides for the reciprocal restraint of human individuals by one another and so makes them better, not by destroying their wicked instincts, but by accustoming them to controlling their wicked instincts. Therefore, for Mosca, the best government is based not on promoting individual liberty and the idea that man is inherently good, but on protecting individual liberty from other individuals, because man is inherently sinful. And since humans are inherently sinful, human institutions are therefore inherently fallible. Accordingly, Mosca asserted, quote, the freest country is a country where the rights of the governed are best protected against arbitrary caprice and tyranny on the part of rulers. Here it is clear why Mosca retracted his support of Mussolini's fascism. Though favorable to a strong central government, Mosca did not support Mussolini's destruction of intellectual freedom and due process. As Burnham explained, quote, juridical defense means government by law and due process, not merely in terms of formal power, in the words of laws and constitutions, but also in terms of real power, in the practical restriction of those in power and effective protection of individual rights against the state. Here again, Burnham speaks in terms of his distinction between real and formal meaning. For example, in the United States, formal power is perhaps best embodied in the Bill of Rights, all of which are, as recommended by Burnham, restrictions against the state and protections of individual rights. Real power, on the other hand, would entail execution of state power so that individual liberties guaranteed by the Bill of Rights remain effectively safeguarded. Most important for Mosca, and one instance where his view stands contrary to Machiavelli's, he identified free speech as the most important liberty above all others. Indeed, this right is placed first above all others, quite literally, in the Bill of Rights. Thus, it seems Jefferson and the authors of the Bill of Rights would have wholeheartedly agreed with Mosca. But, as Burnham warned, quote, the mere formal structure of laws and constitutions, or the institutional arrangements, cannot guarantee juridical defense. Hitler never repealed the Weimar Constitution, and Stalin ordered the adoption of the most democratic constitution in the history of the world. Indeed, Anthony Scalia, the former Justice of the Supreme Court, loved pointing out this fact of the Soviet Constitution to law students. For example, in his constitutional law lecture at USC on April 10th, 2012, Scalia noted that the Soviet Bill of Rights on paper, quote, was wonderful. It was better than ours. In addition to rights of free speech, privacy, and due process provided in the American Bill of Rights, the Soviet Constitution provided liberties such as the right to rest and leisure, the right to work, the right to education, and even the right to maintenance in old age. However, in terms of Burnham's real and formal meaning, the fact that the Soviet Union enumerated these rights in a formal document did not mean that the Soviet citizens enjoyed those rights in reality. Scalia frequently brought this up to law students and even members of Congress to illustrate the importance of separation of powers, checks and balances, and what Machiavelli called mixed government. And these are central features of the American federalist system, which, to a greater degree than the Soviet Union, historically guaranteed the rights of its constitution, both formally and in reality, though imperfectly. Therefore, Burnham concluded, quote, only power can control power. This closely follows Machiavelli's conclusion that mixed government is the best form of government. In Mosca's view, such an arrangement is the only way to secure juridical defense, the loss of which ends in tyranny, the worst form of government. As Burnham elaborated, quote, juridical defense can only be secure where there are at work various and opposing tendencies and forces, and where these mutually check and restrain each other. Protective balance must be established between the autocratic and liberal principles, and between the aristocratic and democratic tendencies. In other words, too much of the autocratic tendency leads to inflexibility and social stagnation. Too much of the democratic tendency leads to anarchy and chaos. Therefore, a balance must be struck between the two in order to secure a strong juridical defense against both the aristocratic and democratic tendencies. Without this juridical defense, civilization cannot prosper. As Burnham said, firm juridical defense is required for the attainment and maintenance of a relatively high level of civilization. By 1923, with the revised edition of The Ruling Class, from which the English translation is derived, Mosca concluded that the major parliamentary representative systems of the 19th century reached the highest level of juridical defense and civilization in history. In many ways, as Burnham pointed out, this was a remarkable opinion for Mosca to have held. The chief theme of his entire work is a devastating attack on the entire theoretical basis of democratic and parliamentary doctrine. But, as Burnham also pointed out, Mosca did not praise parliamentary representative government for its own sake. Rather, Mosca believed that such systems complemented the unique circumstances of the 19th century and were accompanied by a relatively high level of juridical defense, and therefore civilization. Indeed, this conclusion is not so surprising considering Mosca's commitment to the Machiavellian tradition of taking a relativistic approach to government. Again, Mosca did not praise parliamentary representative government for its own sake. Rather, he believed the social, economic, and moral characteristics of the West in the 19th century provided the conditions suitable to democratic republicanism, which, again, in the context of the 19th century, provided a system that afforded a strong juridical defense. In other words, parliamentary representative governments that emerged in the West during the 19th century complemented the culture and political economies of the times, and consequently afforded an unprecedented level of juridical defense, and, accordingly, the highest degree of civilization in history, at least for Mosca. In sum, Mosca delivered penetrating insights not only into politics, but into history and human nature itself. Indeed, he could not have made such profound contributions to political science without keen awareness of the constant and variable factors of human nature and their political systems. Moreover, following the Machiavellian tradition, Mosca's awareness of these constant and variable factors in human societies allowed him to formulate a scientific approach to politics, or as he called it, elements of political science. Mosca's calculated, dispassionate analysis of politics and power often led him to startling conclusions, but the truth is often unsettling. And if science endeavors to discover laws of nature, and nature is a cruel mistress, then political science seeks to uncover laws of politics, and politics is often a contact sport, to paraphrase former Representative Steve Chabot. With that in mind, it is perhaps fitting to close by quoting at length this brutally honest passage from Mosca. The feeling that springs spontaneously from an unprejudiced judgment of the history of humanity is compassion for the contradictory qualities of this poor human race of ours, so rich in abnegation, so ready at times for personal sacrifice, yet whose every attempt, whether more or less successful or not at all successful, to attain moral and material betterment is coupled with an unleashing of hates, rancors, and the basest passions. A tragic destiny is that of men. Aspiring ever to pursue and achieve what they think is the good, they ever find pretexts for slaughtering and persecuting each other. Once they slaughtered and persecuted over the interpretation of a dogma or of a passage in the Bible. Then they slaughtered and persecuted in order to inaugurate the kingdom of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Today, they are slaughtering and persecuting and fiendishly torturing each other in the name of other creeds. Perhaps tomorrow they will slaughter and torment each other in an effort to banish the last trace of violence and injustice from the earth. This concludes my summary of Part 3 of the Machiavellians by James Burnham. Please subscribe so you don't miss upcoming summaries of the remaining parts of the Machiavellians, which will discuss George Sorel, Vilfredo Pareto, and Robert Michels. And thanks to Moe's Night Market for sponsoring this video. Located in Missoula and Valier, Montana, Moe's Night Market sells new and gently used treasures, including books, movies, games, music, and more. Use code RadioBen20 for 20% off your order during the month of April 2025, and a link to Moe's Night Market will be provided in the description below.